coming up on the remarkable 20th century.
If I can just get you to come down here and take the oath.
We, the Negro citizens, have decided not to ride the buses.
You're tearing me apart!
The 1950s was the first full decade of the Cold War, and events suggested that our side was not winning. The communist bloc had expanded across Europe to the outskirts of Hamburg, Germany on the North Sea on one side, and across China to the Pacific Ocean on the other. Now came a bloody thrust. Soviet satellite North Korea sought to add on South Korea by armed invasion. American troops had to be sent in to keep the rest of Asia from falling. When Chinese troops entered on the communist side, it became one of the ugliest wars of the age. What looked like a worldwide communist campaign of conquest drew a pall of fear over America, not unlike that after Pearl Harbor. And a native demagogue arose to exploit it and to foul American politics for much of the decade. Senator Joe McCarthy sought to revive his sinking political career by pounding the theme that we were failing because the U.S. was riddled with communists. As one who was blacklisted at that time, I can tell you it was a hairy period. The consolation was that those blacklisted with me included Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, and Orson Welles, and other people you'd like to be associated with. Eventually, the Korean communists were contained with no gain. McCarthy was denounced as a charlatan by the U.S. Senate. Stalin died and the Cold War quieted for a while. And now a very prosperous America faced up to an internal revolution over rights for black Americans. An undercurrent of the time, the wonderful GI Bill of Rights was quietly supplying the nation with its best educated generation ever, a token that the U.S. would do all right in the Cold War or any other important competition. The 1950s, the decade of Truman and Eisenhower.
As the world entered the 1950s, the post-war baby boom era was in full swing, causing a major shift in world population. In America, suburbs were erected to accommodate a burgeoning middle class. Thriving in record employment, rising wages, and a higher standard of living, Americans were whirled into a consumer buying frenzy by Madison Avenue advertising. Many lived beyond their means. They bought, everything from the family wagon to household appliances on credit that was easily acquired.
Just set a dial and walk away.
However, growing tension between the superpowers kept the world on edge. By 1950, both the United States and the Soviet Union had the atomic bomb. Communist expansion into Eastern Europe and throughout Asia was viewed by the West as a threat to all democratic nations. Confrontation seemed inevitable. The strain gave way in June of 1950 when 90,000 Soviet-armed North Korean soldiers swarmed across the border of South Korea and began the Korean War.
Prior to World War II, Korea was a colony of Japan. At the end of the war, it was temporarily divided along the 38th parallel between the United States occupation forces in the south and Soviet forces in the north.
It was the expectation of the Western Allies, certainly, that Korea would be united, that we were simply there with that dividing line to, as a line for which the Soviets would disarm the Japanese on one side and we'd disarm the Japanese on the southern side of that line.
What was intended to be a temporary partition led to a divided Korea by 1948 with two rival governments, one in the north, one in the south, both governments seeking total unification on their terms. The initiative came from the North Koreans, and they launched a massive invasion on June 25th, 1950.
the United States responded by sending supplies to South Korea, and the United Nations Security Council condemned the action and called for military sanctions.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival.
U.S. combat forces were deployed to Korea and were soon joined by 19 nations under a unified UN command headed by U.S. Commander-in-Chief in the Far East, Douglas MacArthur.
We didn't do very well in the first months of the war. The North Koreans shattered the South Korean army. There in August, it looked like the cause might be lost. And then reinforcements began to arrive. And then MacArthur mounted his masterpiece, the landing at Incheon, which turned the war around.
Joined by the UN forces from Busan, MacArthur liberated Seoul and pushed the North back to the 38th parallel, signaling a move from a police action to a full offensive war. But the threat was not only from North Korea. 2 days after Thanksgiving in 1950, 360,000 Chinese troops crept across the Korean border and surrounded UN forces at the Yalu River. General MacArthur regrouped for a full-scale attack on China and lobbied hard for his aggressive solution to end the spread of communism in Asia, even if it meant the use of nuclear weapons. But President Truman had no interest in starting the next World War and refused to give MacArthur the go-ahead.
But MacArthur moved further and further away from the political direction that he was getting from Washington. And so Truman, who didn't like him in the first place, inevitably relieved him in April of 1951.
It is with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
It's important to remember that all the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff supported Truman when he relieved MacArthur. MacArthur was a very competent military commander and a very popular officer in the general public, and I think that many thought that MacArthur might be a candidate for the presidency at that particular time.
MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome and traveled to Washington to address a joint session of Congress.
I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the right to see that duty. Goodbye.
The Korean War raged until 1953, taking the lives of 34,000 Americans, with 3 times that number wounded. The Koreans suffered losses in the millions.
From mid-1951, it had become apparent to both sides that neither could win a total victory. And therefore, a series of talks began while the fighting continued. And for a variety of reasons, these talks continued almost for another year, year and a half. The war ended with an armistice rather than with a peace settlement. And it included a demilitarized boundary that separated the North from the South, with the line set essentially where the fighting had stopped.
In 1951, the New York Yankees still dominated the diamond, winning the World Series for a 3rd straight year. Joe DiMaggio retired, but an up-and-coming dynamo named Mickey Mantle followed in his footsteps. This agile Oklahoman could run, field, and hit from both sides of the plate. He slugged 536 career home runs and went on to become one of the game's all-time greats. Across town, the New York Giants signed young Willie Mays, who for 21 seasons dazzled fans in the field, on the bases, and at the plate, amassing 660 career home runs. Rocky Marciano slugged his way to history in the sport of boxing. He is still the only heavyweight fighter never to lose a professional match. A devastating puncher, Marciano won 43 of his 49 fights by knockout. At the same time, Many considered Sugar Ray Robinson, pound for pound, to be the best lightweight boxer ever to grace the ring.
Even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
The threat of communist expansion was at the forefront of people's minds, especially that of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Hardly known outside Wisconsin and vying for national attention, McCarthy campaigned zealously against the spread of global communism.
There was, in fact, a Red Scare in this country, but it was not without some basis in fact. You know, there were sustained efforts by the Soviet Union to infiltrate America's secrets, our society, our economy, and the FBI and the other intelligence and law enforcement agencies in the United States did a remarkable job of containing that.
Anti-communist fervor climaxed in March of 1951 when engineer Julius Rosenberg and his wife Ethel were tried and convicted of transmitting atomic military secrets to a Soviet spy. In 1953, after numerous appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court and a refusal of clemency by President Eisenhower, the Rosenbergs were executed at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York.
Julius and Ethel Rosenberg have gone to the electric chair.
In the early 50s, most Americans still turned to radio for news and entertainment.
Unless you happen to live in some parts of the country where, thanks to the newest marvel of modern science, television, you can just lean back in a comfortable chair in the theater or in your own favorite chair at home. Through its magic, we are able to enjoy a combination of the radio, motion pictures, and the stage, right in the comfort of our own homes, simply by pushing a button and turning a dial. Of course, television can't perform such miracles as this, yet. But perhaps there's no harm wishing that it could.
By 1952, television could be found in over 10 million homes, roughly 25% of all households, and was growing daily. Milton Berle stumbled into our living rooms, reaching 5 million homes by 1952 as host of the Texaco Star Theater.
Ricky, this is it.
This is it.
I Love Lucy bumped Uncle Milty to second place in the ratings, becoming the archetype for all situational comedies to follow.
Who are you, Humphrey Bogart? No, but you are.
Sitcom classic The Honeymooners, starring Jackie Gleason and Art Carney, quickly became a national pastime.
Oh, no, my wife's the only one who gets tired.
Oh, and then there was a doctor in the next office whistling. And
This doctor was whistling?
yes, and the nurse said that was Dr. Brown, the famous obstetrician.
I see.
She said that last year he had 260 babies. And I said, well, I bet his wife isn't whistling.
George Burns and Gracie Allen built on their popular radio show to become even bigger with television audiences.
Some guys are at their best.
Television also revived the careers of veteran showmen like Jimmy Durante, Red Skelton, and Groucho Marx.
How did you meet your wife?
Well, actually, one night there, I met her in the dark room.
You met your wife in the dark room?
Yes, sir.
Was she well developed?
Young people had their favorites, too. Howdy Doody provided the daily dose of fun and games.
Well, howdy doody, kids, and hiya, Mr. Smith. Hi, little guy, howdy. And Clarabelle, look at all the kids at home and all the kids in the gallery. What time is it, kids?
The Lone Ranger found its way to the boob tube from early radio and continued to entertain kids of all ages. As the television craze caught on, box office sales dropped. Hollywood responded with 3D movies and an outpouring of special effect films, hoping to entice the public out from their living rooms and back into the theaters. As 3D movies quickly died out, drive-in theaters sprang back to life. From behind the wheel, audiences watched such classics as Singin' in the Rain, starring Gene Kelly, and High Noon, which featured veteran actor Gary Cooper, whose performance won him the Oscar for Best Actor that year. The film also featured the debut of young actress Grace Kelly. 4 years later, she would forego her movie career to marry Prince Rainier III from Monaco, the tiny principality on the French Riviera. In world affairs, the reins of power changed hands in February of 1952, when King George of England died and his daughter, Elizabeth II, ascended the throne at the age of 25.
She, of course, comes to the throne not long after the end of the war, at that point where Britain seems to be getting back on its feet. And so she can symbolize, and does symbolize, I think, for both politicians and the public, this new era of prosperity and peace and stability.
At age 33, Argentina's beloved Eva Perón died from cancer in July of 1952. The charismatic wife of President Perón was cherished as a folk hero by her people, initiating such reforms as voting rights for the poor. That year, General Batista, the strongman of Cuba from 1933 to 1944, reclaimed power by ousting civilian President Carlos Socorros in a military coup and proclaimed himself chief of the revolution.
I shall not accept a renomination. I do not feel that it is my duty to spend another 4 years in the White House.
The United States was also ready for a new leader. After Harry Truman refused to run again, the Democrats nominated the eloquent governor from Illinois, Adlai Stevenson. The Republican candidate was the revered war hero, General Dwight Eisenhower, who split the ticket with a young senator from California, Richard Nixon.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have summoned me on behalf of millions of your fellow Americans to lead a great crusade for freedom in America and freedom in the world. I know something of the solemn responsibility of leading a crusade. I have led one.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We'll take Ike to Washington.
As the election approached, Nixon found himself in the center of controversy when reports surfaced accusing him of operating an anti-communist slush fund. Via television, Nixon denied such reports.
Not 1 cent of the $18,000 or any other money of that type ever went to me for my personal use. Every penny of it was used to pay for political expenses that I did not think should be charged to the taxpayers of the United States. But the decision, my friends, is not mine. I would do nothing that would harm the possibilities of Dwight Eisenhower to become president of the United States.
When November came, Eisenhower won the election, becoming the first Republican to win the office since Herbert Hoover was elected in 1928. "1952 saw the first explosion of the hydrogen bomb. Tested on a mile-wide atoll near the Marshall Islands, the brainchild of Edward Teller proved to be more than 500 times more potent than the atom bomb.
A closely guarded secret for more than a year. An atomic blast set off on the lonely atoll of Eniwetok, 4,500 miles out in the Pacific, is released to the public to show the devastating effects of the bomb on fighting equipment and all types of buildings. Scientists term the experiment an entire success, a success in destruction. As the smoke rises on Eniwetok, the curtain rises on the seeds of man's oblivion.
The continued development of these weapons exacerbated public paranoia. Bomb shelters popped up around the country, and air raid drills became a regular occurrence. A more beneficial development was made in 1953, when Francis Crick and Maurice Watson discovered the molecular code carrier in chromosomes, deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, the smallest building blocks of life.
Watson and Crick were the first to elucidate the double helix structure of DNA. This was a great advance in biology. They reported it in April of 1953 in the journal Nature. It was just a one-page paper, which I think really shows the great humility of these two scientists as well as their genius. Their model of DNA, of course, has two strands, each one of which can serve as a template for replication of a new daughter molecule. And this explained right away how genetic information can be transmitted from one generation to the next down through the eons.
May I kiss your hand?
I always say a kiss on the hand feels very good, but a diamond tiara lasts forever.
Men grow cold as girls grow old.
1953 was a pivotal year in the life of America's blonde goddess, Marilyn Monroe. Her films Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire set the stage for her meteoric rise to fame. She wed baseball great Joe DiMaggio. The same month, she graced the cover and centerfold of a new breed of magazine, Playboy. The magazine's founder, Hugh Hefner, challenged sexual taboos and created a new forum for adult literature.
I think that the major influence of Playboy, and of my life itself, is to suggest that there are other moral ways of living your life. It's really a response to the repressive Puritanism of not simply America, but of other parts of the world. But sex is one part, properly understood, of the best of who we are. It's the life force. It is the thing that attracts two sexes on this planet to one another. And what a cold planet it would be if there was only one sex and we reproduce in some other way. I think it is what kindles us and gives us our hopes and our dreams.
Overt sexual behavior soon became more acceptable. In the year's most acclaimed film, From Here to Eternity, an extended, passionate kiss between Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr broke Hollywood mores that lingered from the old Hays Code.
I never knew it could be like this. Nobody ever kissed me the way you do.
As the sexual revolution began, America was simultaneously experiencing a spiritual reawakening. Church membership was reaching record levels. People from near and far swarmed into stadiums to hear the words of evangelist Billy Graham. Congress added "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and declared the nation's motto to be "In God We Trust," marking it on all currency. As a new era began in the U.S., March of 1953 marked the end of an era in Russia. The Soviet Union lost its infamous leader, Joseph Stalin, to a brain hemorrhage. He was succeeded by Georgy Malenkov.
Malenkov, only for a very short time, was the chief of both the party and the Soviet government. Then, in a month, Khrushchev became the Secretary General of the party. That was always the most important position.
On May 29, 1953, history was made when New Zealand mountaineer Edmund Hillary and his partner Tenzing Norgay were the first to reach the summit of the world's tallest mountain, Mount Everest. At over 29,000 feet above sea level, the two climbers inhaled bottled oxygen and braved the bitter cold for a 15-minute stay. In the world of sports, fans witnessed the first ever Grand Slam winner of women's tennis, Maureen Connolly. Affectionately known as Little Mo, she smashed her way to victory in the Australian, French, British, and American Opens. In 1954, over 90 years after Abraham Lincoln first issued the Emancipation Proclamation, racial equality was far from reality, especially in the South, where legal segregation oppressed black Americans and kept the races divided.
In my hometown, no African-American bus drivers, no black salespeople in downtown Greenville. We did not have the right to vote. My father was a veteran. We could not borrow money from the banks, could not work in the banks as tellers, could not own a radio or TV station or a media outlet, could not do other than menial jobs in the textile industry. So it took the form of radical, rigid apartheid, just one step above slavery.
Intent on change, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People pushed for desegregation in public schools, filing Brown versus Board of Education and 4 other lawsuits to be heard in the Supreme Court. NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall, who later became the first black Supreme Court justice, challenged the concept of separate but equal facilities.
Thurgood Marshall argues that segregation inherently stigmatizes an entire race of people and thereby denies them equal protection under the laws that the 14th Amendment guarantees them.
The case was made and the Supreme Court agreed that there really was no equality in separate schools, that they could not be separate and equal. And that then, as a matter of law, was struck down.
As the fight to desegregate schools gathered momentum, conflict in Indochina came to a head. After World War II, France attempted to recolonize Indochina, but met strong resistance from guerrilla forces led by Ho Chi Minh. After years of fighting, French troops were decisively defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. By the fall of 1954, French colonial rule in Indochina had come to an end. At the Geneva summit, both Laos and Cambodia were granted their independence, and Vietnam was divided in 2. The South remained democratic, while the North embraced communist rule.
A court in 1954 divided Vietnam into 2 zones, cut along the 17th parallel. And that was defined not to be an international border, but a temporary dividing line. But very soon, this dividing line congealed into a de facto international line.
The Geneva Agreement called for a temporary division and regrouping of forces between North and South to be followed by elections to unify the country. The United States government opposed the Geneva settlement. The Eisenhower administration encouraged the formation of a nationalist government, an anti-communist nationalist government in the South, and encouraged it to reject elections for reunification.
When Ho Chi Minh vowed to reunify the South under the communist banner, President Eisenhower offered aid and military advisors to the Saigon government.
The cost of defending freedom, of defending America, must be paid in many forms and in many places. Unassisted, Vietnam cannot, at this time, produce and support the military formations essential to it.
The United States government feared that the fall of South Vietnam would create a domino effect, causing the fall, a ripple effect, the fall of governments throughout Southeast Asia, one by one.
If I can just get you to come down here and take the oath so we can get the answers to some questions. Now, you're not fooling anyone at all.
Senator,
I'm sure of that.
Senator, let me tell you something.
The chair believes that
the American people have had a look at you for 6 weeks. You're not fooling anyone either.
Senator Potter.
Americans will best remember 1954 for the sensational Senate hearings of Joseph R. McCarthy. McCarthy and his top aide Roy Cohn turned their sights on the Army in late 1953.
At this time, there was a very, very great concern about communist infiltration of the United States government. There was clear evidence that the communists had infiltrated war agencies and the government in general. Senator McCarthy created a wave of fear, and he did so with some rather scurrilous charges.
The world watched the McCarthy Army hearings unfold on television.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness.
McCarthy stumbled under the questioning of the Army's lead attorney, Joseph Welch, and suffered a devastating loss of credibility.
Have you left no sense of decency?
He was formally condemned by a Senate proclamation in December of '54.
The threats from communism may have been at the forefront of people's minds during the 50s, but there were other items worth noting. An athletic standard to which every runner aspires was established when a good friend of mine named Roger Bannister, a young Oxford University medical student, became the first person in recorded history to break the 4-minute mile. In homes across the country, the golden age of television led to the introduction of TV dinners. two revolutions in plastic first appeared. Lego, the building blocks of many a child's imagination, and second, plastic money, known to everyone as the credit card.
The bad boys of cinema were gaining popularity. Marlon Brando, after reprising his Broadway role in Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire for the big screen, continued his rise. In 1954, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his work in On the Waterfront.
Come on, I better get you home. There's too many guys around here with only one thing in their mind.
Film fans also saw him in another defining role that year, as the brooding leader of a motorcycle gang in The Wild One.
You're tearing me apart!
What?
You say one thing, he says another, and everybody changes back again!
James Dean became an overnight sensation in two films, Rebel Without a Cause and East of Eden. More than just a teen heartthrob, he symbolized the rebellious angst of the adolescent generation. He finished one more film only weeks before dying in a tragic car crash in September of 1955.
I guess you're about the best-looking gal we've seen around here in a long time.
Giant became an instant hit, with The Fallen Idol sharing the screen with Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson. An important new medical advance was made in 1955. Dr. Jonas Salk at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine successfully tested a vaccine for the polio virus. Within months of Salk's announcement, the vaccine was certified as a treatment, and a massive child inoculation program was initiated. Within a few years, the dreaded disease was no longer a threat to the world. Another weapon was added to the United States Cold War arsenal. The U.S. Navy launched the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. Powered by a small piece of uranium, the USS Nautilus was faster, bigger, and able to stay beneath the waters for an indefinite amount of time. On land, the car was king. After a production low of 85,000 cars per year during the war, the number skyrocketed to 7.9 million in 1955. With this increase, the old functional shapes of early models gave way to stylish new cars that quickly gained in popularity.
The automotive design of the 50s grew out of America's being on top of the world after World War II. We really felt that we could do anything. We were in a position to solve any engineering challenge. With that in mind, once the pent-up demand for new cars was satisfied in the early 50s, Detroit started to realize that they really now had to sell people on their cars.
Why be stuck with one expensive car when you can enjoy all the fun and freedom of two fine Fords? 3 weeks ago, we bought another Ford, the new low-priced custom-line Victoria. Isn't it stunning? Dave has it all to himself, and I now have the ranch wagon all to myself. It's a whole new way of life. Now I'm free to go anywhere, do anything, see anybody anytime I want to. It's only good common sense.
When people think of the 50s, they automatically think of fins and soaring taillights and chrome and other cliches. The bigger, the better, longer, lower, wider, sleeker, and more equipment.
As the car became a more integral part of society, culture adapted. Motor inns, or motels, appeared on virtually every stretch of road. Drive-in diners, drive-in banks, almost any service that was once offered to pedestrians was now available to cars. 1955 was the year Chicago businessman Ray Kroc opened his first successful restaurant in Des Plaines, Illinois. He franchised the idea of assembly line hamburgers from the McDonald brothers and helped revolutionize the fast food industry. 1955 was also the year Walt Disney opened a themed amusement park in Anaheim, California. Disneyland and its Magic Kingdom has become the trademark of American creativity and family fun. The spark that ignited the civil rights movement into action occurred in December of 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, when a black seamstress named Rosa Parks boarded a bus on her way home from work.
I was on the bus, sitting back where I was supposed to be. The man, young white man, didn't find a seat where the white people were. so he was just standing up. And when the bus driver saw him standing up, he ordered all four of us, the two women who were across the aisle and the man who was sharing the seat with me, to get up. And they were somewhat reluctant. They did stand up, and when he saw me sitting down, he wanted to know if I was going to stand up, and I said, no, I'm not. And he said, if you don't stand up, I'm going to have you arrested. And so I was arrested. He had two officers, policemen, to come on the bus to escort me to the jail. The people in Montgomery decided that they would not ride the bus anymore until some changes were made.
We, the Negro citizens, have decided not to ride the buses in Montgomery until we receive some justice and until we get a hearing, even if it takes a year.
Dr. King, a 26-year-old young minister, emerged with this powerful oratory and capacity to articulate what was happening. Dr. King's presence and articulation, her singular act of courage, came together and exploded with new possibility.
This morning, the long-awaited mandate from the United States Supreme Court concerning bus segregation came to Montgomery. Segregation in public transportation is both legally and sociologically invalid. The year-old protest against city buses is officially called off, and the Negro citizens of Montgomery are urged to return to the buses tomorrow morning on a non-segregated basis.
In world politics, the Middle East was in the news. After 72 years of occupation, Britain granted Egypt its sovereignty in July of '54, relinquishing control to President Nasser. In July of 1956, Nasser seized control of Europe's lifeline, the Suez Canal, which was primarily operated under European interest. Crisis erupted in October when Israel, Britain, and France attempted to regain control by military force.
The Suez Canal, lifeline of Europe, in a dramatic sequence of events, became a cause of war when President Abdel Nasser announced its seizure by Egypt. Thrust, Israeli troops struck down the Sinai Peninsula to within a few miles of the canal itself. Within days, Egyptian forces were completely routed. The stage was set for the next move in the complex Suez situation. Britain and France, after a short ultimatum, in a joint sea and air invasion, attacked, following a preliminary air bombardment. From a staging area on Cyprus, airborne troops quickly followed and established a beachhead at the entrance to the canal. They were followed by seaborne contingents which swiftly controlled the Mediterranean end of the vital waterway. The debris and chaos of bombing greeted the Anglo-French forces as they entered the conquered cities. But even as the occupation proceeded, world opinion against the invasion was mobilized.
The Soviets and U.S. denounced the invasion and sent troops to enforce a UN ceasefire. Soon thereafter, the dispute was settled, and Israeli, British, and French forces withdrew, and the canal remained under Egyptian control.
Nasser, in the Arab world, became the hero. That was seen as his ability to stand up to colonialism that had pushed the Arabs since the 16th, 17th century. They've been pushed around by European powers, and that finally they got the monkey off their back.
Back in Europe, another conflict arose in the fall of '56, when a civilian uprising broke out in the Hungarian capital of Budapest. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, crushing the uprising, killing thousands of civilians in 3 days of vicious fighting. The world was repulsed by the pictures that made their way out, proving that the Soviets would use any means to protect their interests in Eastern Europe.
Nothing, of course, has so disturbed the American people as the events in Hungary. Our hearts have gone out to them, and we have done everything that is possible to, in the way of alleviating suffering. But I must make one thing clear. The United States does now, and never has, advocate open rebellion by an undefended populace against force, over which they could not possibly prevail.
During his presidency, I joined in the kind of common wisdom of the press corps in Washington, that he really wasn't in deep command of his forces, of the country. And I asked him some very detailed questions about various decisions made in the White House during his term. And he knew about all of them. There wasn't a one that he could not contribute something about the discussion that had gone on and to making the decision, about why he made the decision at the time. I was dumbfounded.
In November of 1956, Americans seemed content with the Republican administration. The nation prospered, the economy was growing, and Eisenhower rode the wave of popularity into another term.
Hi, everybody. How y'all? This is yours truly, Alan Freed, welcoming you to the Big Beat once again.
By 1956, rock and roll was here to stay. Coined by New York disc jockey Alan Freed, rock and roll took the nation by storm. Originating in the late 40s and early 50s, it was rooted in a blend of black gospel, blues, and jazz known as rhythm and blues. Guitar ace Chuck Berry helped define the rock and roll sound with his lexicon of hot guitar riffs. The hair-raising exuberance of Little Richard's Tutti Frutti captured the energy of rock and roll. Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame cooled things by virtue of the blues and launched a 20-year career of hit-making.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11,
Whites inspired by the Black Pioneers soon shared the spotlight. Bill Haley and the Comets shot up the charts with Rock Around the Clock, which quickly became the most played and purchased song in the land. Young Texan Buddy Holly found his way to the top of the charts. So did the explosive piano player from Louisiana, Jerry Lee Lewis. But the undisputed king was a former Memphis truck driver from Mississippi, Elvis Presley.
Elvis Presley was the essence of rock and roll. I mean, and a lot of people, in retrospect, attack Elvis for stealing the black music and making it white. Elvis Presley had a black soul with a white face. He was definitely the first rock and roller to take sex out of the closet. I mean, he was doing almost stripper bump and grind type moves. He was just awesome to watch. It was like an uncaged animal.
Aside from rock and roll, the 50s gave birth to the era of the beatnik. In the vernacular of streetwise jazz musicians, this new breed of disaffected bohemians were beat, downtrodden, a counterculture rebelling against everything middle class. Inspired by the high-velocity jams of bebop musicians Dizzy Gillespie and the late great Charlie Bird Parker, novelist Jack Kerouac chronicled the essence of the beat generation in his signature work, On the Road, published in 1957. In Arkansas, the explosive issue of civil rights ignited once again. 6 years after a Supreme Court ruling required the integration of public schools, only 4 southern states had complied. When 9 black students went to enroll at Little Rock Central High and were turned away, tensions flared, and Arkansas's Governor Orville Faubus ordered state troops to protect the school from forced integration.
I will not force my people to integrate against their will. I believe in the democratic processes and principles of government.
Under a court order, Faubus sent the troops home, leaving 150 city policemen to protect the black students. When the students attempted to enroll again, the police did little to stop a racist mob from attacking the students and sympathetic whites. The following day, the president sent 1,100 paratroopers to quell the violence and federalize the Arkansas National Guard. Central High was integrated, but the troops remained for the rest of the year. In a race for superior technology, the Soviets mastered rocket flight first and launched Sputnik on October 4th, 1957.
We had very poor computational equipment. Our computers at that period were simply bad, but mathematicians were excellent. So they worked on this very bad equipment in a very efficient way.
The world's first artificial satellite circled the Earth every 96 minutes, 500 miles above the surface. 1 month later, Sputnik 2 carried a dog into space and sparked an outcry in America.
It really became in the public conscious what the space program was all about. And of course, if the Russians were able to launch Sputnik into space, the fear was, well, they could also launch atomic missiles.
America's first attempt to launch a satellite, a 6.5-inch sphere weighing just over 3 pounds, was checked out by scientists and declared ready. A great wave of advanced publicity focused attention at Cape Canaveral, Florida, for the launching of Test Vehicle 3 of Project Vanguard, a preliminary to the scheduled launching of a 21-pound satellite in March. What happened is already unhappy history. Another setback for the United States in the race into outer space. Here are official Defense Department films of the launching of the 72-foot missile, a loss of thrust, and fall back to Earth in split seconds.
America responded by trying to focus its program to a greater degree. The Navy tried it through the Vanguard program, which was not successful. Then the Army, where Wernher von Braun, formerly of Germany, had his team assembled, and they were given the go-ahead, and they actually successfully launched a rocket.
On February 1st, 1958, America's first satellite, Explorer 1, was placed into orbit. That same year, the U.S. took another giant step forward when Congress established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Congress passed another milestone in 1958. After years of debate, the Alaskan Territory was added to the Union, becoming the 49th state. A year later, Hawaii was added, increasing the United States of America to an even 50. Alfred Hitchcock continued his string of masterful thrillers in 1958 with Vertigo, starring James Stewart. The English-born American director and producer was a formidable presence throughout the 1950s, teaming with some of Hollywood's leading stars and creating many brilliant films. Although he never won an Academy Award, Hitchcock's work has achieved classic status in the annals of film history. As 1959 arrived, the first regulated safe form of oral contraception was introduced to the general public. Developed by American Gregor Pincus, the pill quickly became the method of choice for family planning worldwide. But no discovery had a more profound effect on the world like the integrated circuit. Developed by Jack and Robert Noyce, it signaled the birth of the information age and eventually led to the personal computer and a host of portable electronic devices. The year in sports belonged to a young, charismatic golfer named Arnold Palmer. With the help of nationally televised tournaments and bigger purses, Palmer helped transform the sport and became its leading money winner and unofficial spokesman. In basketball, 6'10" Bill Russell was one of the NBA's marquee players. In 1959, Russell and teammate Bob Cousy led the Boston Celtics to the first of 8 consecutive national championships. In the movies, Ben-Hur swept the 1959 Academy Awards, winning 11 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Charlton Heston's moving portrayal.
Certainly it was clear to everyone that the film, unless it was just collapsed, if we all stumbled and fell while making it, or died making it, that it was going to be an enormously important film, as it was. You know, it won more Oscars than any film has won or is likely to win. And of course, its financial popularity persists to this day.
As the decade came to a close, so did the rule of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Batista and his government were ousted by a band of nationalist guerrillas led by Fidel Castro.
From his stronghold in the wild Sierra Maestre Mountains, Cuba's Fidel Castro emerged triumphant after 2 years of guerrilla warfare against the Batista regime. The revolution that began with Castro a fugitive, practically alone, landing with 82 followers, to be nearly wiped out by government forces, ended with the flight of dictator Fulgencio Batista and the entry into Havana of rebel forces to be acclaimed by the city. Six years of surface prosperity and government corruption, of repression and police brutality, bred explosive discontent. Now Batista has fled. A new leader is on the scene, Fidel Castro, in many ways an unknown quantity in his politics and policies, but certain to be dominant in Cuba's new era, just begun.
The U.S. government initially favored Castro, but when he stoked the fires of anti-American rhetoric and imposed a Marxist system, that attitude quickly changed. Meanwhile, competition between the United States and the Soviet Union heightened as the race to put a human into space entered the home stretch. In the spring of '59, NASA named a group of 7 young flyers, mostly test pilots, to man the Mercury program.
They wanted an experienced test pilot. They wanted a person with a minimum amount of jet flying time. You had to be 5'11" or under, and you had to be 170 pounds or under.
Gordon Cooper, Virgil Grissom, Alan Shepard, Scott Carpenter, John Glenn, Donald Slayton, and Wally Schirra became America's first astronauts.
The Mercury program was to prove that you could launch a man without killing him, and you could put him into zero gravity without killing him, and that he could exist in space for short periods of time, and that he could fly the spacecraft just as you would fly an airplane. Something I'd always felt that we would do eventually, but I never really dreamed it would occur in my lifetime.
As the sun set on the 1950s, a new era was dawning amidst the continuing optimism of post-war prosperity. The hope for an even brighter future seemed assured, and the prospect of new achievements and new faces in places of power led the world on into the new frontier.
One of the most important happenings of the 1950s was the reintegration of the South into the nation's economy. Links had never been fully redeveloped after the Civil War, but now the wartime draft had mixed Southern boys with those of the rest of the nation as nothing had done before, and spread notions of new things to do and places to go. Air conditioning, which only then was applied to homes, removed the large obstacle of climate for industries and people wanting to move into an attractive region with educated labor and lots of space. The beginning of Eisenhower's highway program, plus increasing air travel, made access easy and swift. There was a time, to cite an instance, when Birmingham, Alabama's great steel industries were absentee-owned and run. Now the owners and managers there moved to its lovely suburbs to stay. In Texas, George Bush was only the most famous Yankee to opt to become a Southerner and go for oil and politics. The new importance of the South would be measured on the highest level of politics. In the century between the Civil War and World War II, no president was elected to office from a Southern state. After World War II, 4 presidents would be elected from the old Confederacy: Johnson, Carter, Bush, and Clinton. Bringing the South in eventually amounted to adding a new nation onto the pre-war United States, creating a single nation with double the potential of the one that went into World War II. Next time, possibly the most turbulent decade of America's century, the 1960s.
Next time on the remarkable 20th century.
We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s. I must be the greatest. I have a dream.